For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Nick and I head the employment team at Actons. There's a lot of familiar faces on the call, so it's great to see you guys. We are based in Nottingham, but we work with clients across the East Midlands and beyond, and we work with a number of amazing SMEs. That's really our kind of target market in a lot of ways, but actually we also have some great relationships with some household names that you will have heard of as well. So it's great to see you guys. It's not just me, we'll have a fabulous team. And James and Laura are both going to be presenting with me today. So you'll hear from them a bit later in the session. And yeah, we'll get straight into the session. I think what I would encourage you to do is to use the chat, because there's three of us from Actons available and presenting. What we're keen to do is encourage some interactivity, if that's a thing, and therefore when you've got questions, feel free to pop questions in, and we'll try and prompt some sort of discussion in the chat as we go a little bit. I'm thinking things like we're going to be talking about sources of support for employees in this area. So if you've got a great employee assistance program provider that you would recommend, then let's get those details in the chat for people to share. I have to be careful about getting myself in trouble with the occupational health community, because I have done that. But if you've got a great occupational health provider that you would recommend, who's doing great work with you, partnering well and giving good reports when you need medical advice, then feel free to share details there and that kind of thing. I think that would be useful for everybody, and also useful for us actually to see who's doing some good stuff out there. Nikki, thank you for the feedback on the podcast in the chat already. So that's great that we're already interactive. So that's fabulous. So to get started on mental health specifically, what we like to do with all of the webinars that we do is sort of set the scene, or look at the context for why we're even bothering talking about this stuff. Why is it important? Why is it relevant to you? And I think what we've certainly seen is an increase in our caseload in terms of clients coming to us and saying, we've got issues, tricky issues that we need help with, and they involve a whole range of things. But often there's a heavy sort of focus on mental health issues that are causing problems within the workplace. So we thought, well, it's clearly a topical one. It's clearly something that people are grappling with, otherwise they wouldn't be in touch with us. And of course, we're also off the back of Mental Health Awareness Week last week. So we thought actually it was a good time to be focusing on this particular issue. I should say, Laura and I are also trained mental health first aiders. Laura will talk a bit about that later on, but that has been a really excellent kind of way that we've been able to upskill in terms of our understanding of this area as well as the kind of legal stuff. And I think that's the other thing that I would say as part of the introduction, is that lots of what we do is help clients when things have got really, really difficult and have gone wrong. What we're trying to do today is balance that out a little bit by being a bit more positive about the kind of proactive steps that you might take to prevent these issues happening in the first place. But there will be a focus on, okay, well, actually, if this has become difficult, if this has gone wrong, how do we navigate that well as an employer? And sometimes that might be looking at reasonable adjustments, and James will talk through some of that stuff. It might even result in someone's dismissal if it's a serious issue that's led to an absence or an inability to work. But it doesn't have to be that serious all of the time if we get some of this stuff right, I guess, is the message that we're trying to get across. In terms of the context more generally, there's clearly a cost to the business, to the organisation of these kinds of issues, and we've included some stats on the slide. I think from an Indeed survey that was done of quite a large number of employers, and they found that in 2023, 37% of UK workers were struggling with mental health. 92% of UK workers reported experiencing burnout or stress. And I don't think you can avoid in the general press the fact that there are stats about long-term sickness numbers pretty regularly in terms of the number of people who are unable to work as a result of ill health. and I think at the end of 23 we were looking at 2.5 million people. And again, it's pretty obvious, I think, that part of that increase is as a result of an increase in mental health issues. In terms of the specifics around absence related to mental health and the numbers on that, we're looking at 7.8 days on average per employee in 2023 in terms of absence, which was an increase on the figures since the pandemic hit. And again, I think we talked certainly during that pandemic a lot when we were doing these kind of updates about the potential of a ticking time bomb, I think, as we described it, with regards to mental health as a result of the pandemic. So no doubt there is an element of that having contributed to the current situation with mental health issues. I think then as a result, we're certainly also seeing employers spending and focusing a lot of time on, okay, what's our well-being strategy here? How are we going to be proactive about ensuring that we don't have issues in this area or minimize issues in this area? And again, we're certainly seeing an increase in focus on absence management and supporting people back to work, or in fact, out of the organization. The other thing that we thought it was also worth just recapping on is sort of the legal risk. So that's there's a certain amount of context and the cost of the business of people, not performing well or being absent from work. But there's also, if we, worst case scenario, if we don't get this stuff right, we can end up with legal risk. And of course, that's the bit where we often will get involved in trying to help minimize that. But it might be that actually someone's not able to attend work or is underperforming at work to the extent that they are dismissed. And of course, that potentially opens up unfair dismissal risk if the person has 2 years service. That's one of the things that a Labour government might change, just dropping back to the next webinar that we'll be doing. They're talking about that applying potentially even at day one of someone's employment. But for the moment, that's the point if they've been with you for 2 years. And as part of that unfair dismissal risk, managing these issues will involve making sure that we've followed a fair process, that we've got a fair reason for dismissing. And that will include things like looking at what the reason is, often capability. It will involve taking medical advice. It will be consulting with the employee, considering reasonable adjustments and that kind of thing. We'll look at the detail of some of more of that as we go through the session. The reason that's important is that it can cost money if we get it wrong. April is usually the point at which the figures, the compensation are updated for claims, both unfair dismissal and discrimination. And you can see from the slides, the cap on the compensatory award for unfair dismissal, so the loss of earnings element, is now capped at quite a bit, 115, which is a bit like a helpline number of some kind, but it sticks in the mind, and it's a pretty significant amount of money now as well. The other obvious legal risk if someone has a health issue is that they might qualify as disabled under the Equality Act, and again we'll look at the definition of that a bit later, but they might then bring a disability discrimination claim. And of course, they don't need the 2 years service to be able to do that. The types of claims that we often see in this area often relate to a failure to make reasonable adjustments. And again, James will talk us through some more of the detail of that. But also, when it's an absence issue, it's often this arising from claim where we are managing the absence that arises from a potential disability. And yeah, we just need to navigate that well. And again, that's in part because the individual can claim loss of earnings that flows from the discrimination, as well as something called injury to feelings, which many of you will have heard of. But again, those figures in terms of the Vento band, so the level of seriousness that the discrimination has kind of been categorized as, have also been increased, and we're up to the 58,700 there at the top end of the top band of Vento. So again, that's kind of the backdrop to some of the stuff that we're talking about. We're not going to focus, on that much, but it is useful, I think, to set the scene when it comes to, why are we considering some of this. So moving through, again, the kind of common issues that we're seeing in this area when it gets to us are either short-term persistent absence, so somebody that's off, not for a very long period of time, maybe a day here, a day there, but fairly regularly, and that they're putting that down to a mental health issue, or severer cases where actually the person is just not able to attend work at all, and they're on a longer period of absence. We're not going to specifically talk about managing sickness absence in that way because we already did that. So we have a webinar available in the Knowledge Hub on our website, which again, I'm hoping will magically appear in the chat. Thank you, Matt. And we'll have a link to our absence management webinar that we've already done there for you. So if that specifically is of interest, I'd definitely recommend going back and checking that out. But the other issue that we see employers grappling with is underperformance, and you know, the underperformance has been identified, but the person is saying, look, actually this is as a result of my mental health issues, my condition, and then the employer is grappling with, okay, how do we fairly manage this underperformance so that we get the person up to the required level of performance without falling foul of a kind of disability discrimination issue, or actually just we want to be able to support this person well with that mental health concern in order that they're performing well because that makes sense for us. And I suppose that leads on to the next slide, which is why bother with any of this? And lots of you will no doubt say, well, because it's the right thing to do, it's a good thing to do, but actually, you know, the kind of proactive side of this is that we're looking to reduce employee absence. We want people to be happy at work. A happier workforce clearly is a better workforce, and they will produce more essentially if they're in work and, you know, happy and firing. And of course, our bit also then kicks in that you are reducing your legal and financial risk as a result of doing this stuff well. And again, that's why, you know, we thought it was important to focus on it. So I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to talk us through the concept of reasonable adjustments, and yeah, share some hopefully helpful tips on that.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my section, as Nick said, is to do with reasonable adjustments at the beginning, at least. And it's worth taking a step back. This isn't the full, as Nick said, the full managing sickness absence, disability discrimination seminar, but it's always worth just reminding ourselves when we're going to be looking at the context of reasonable adjustments, what we're doing and why. Not every condition will be a disability, as you all know, and just to give everyone a quick reminder, we've put the definition of disability on the slide. So in this seminar, we're looking mainly at the second half of A, mental impairments, and there will be a disability where the impairment has a substantial, and the case law somewhat helpfully describes substantial as more than trivial and long-term adverse effect on someone's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Long-term, just a reminder, is likely to last 12 months. And there's also separate parts of the definition relating to recurring conditions that I'm not going to go into. My main tip on when you're thinking about disabilities is not to get too hung up on the labels or the titles, especially in a mental health context of whether it's stress or depression or anxiety, and look at the impact. So how does it affect their day-to-day activities? It doesn't matter what you call it so much as the impact that it has as to whether it's going to meet the definition or not. As the second to last bullet point says, if something clearly isn't a disability, don't treat it as such, because then you can get into a bit of a tangle when you're assessing different people who clearly do have disabilities. But a good rule of thumb is the last bullet point. If you're not sure, and a time when you might not be sure is if someone has had a condition that's been affecting them for a decent amount of time, but they're not really at the year yet, but you think they might get to the year, then that's the sort of area where there's doubt. And that is it likely to last 12 months? Maybe, maybe not. But if you treat it as if it is, you're going to be on the much safer side of the line. So we talk a lot about duty to make reasonable adjustments. And as I said on the first slide, it's worth taking a step back. When is that duty actually triggered? Well, I'm going to ignore the two scenarios that are slightly less common in the mental health context, which is physical features of premises and the provision of auxiliary aids, and look at the standard situation where a provision, criterion, or practice of the employer puts a disabled worker at a substantial disadvantage in comparison to persons who are not disabled. So that could be something like a policy that requires somebody to work in the office every day. That could have a substantial, put a disabled worker at a substantial disadvantage. I'm not saying that it would necessarily, but it certainly could do. And if it did for that particular worker, then the duty is triggered to take such steps as are reasonable to prevent that disadvantage. The next step, and it's important not to miss that step, is to work out what's putting them at the disadvantage and what the disadvantage is then to assess what adjustments you could make to alleviate that disadvantage. And I think that's important consideration. Remember that the aim of the adjustments is to alleviate the disadvantage. Sometimes an employee will say, I want this, because they might like it, for example. But you need to work through this logically thinking, right, what is it that's putting them at disadvantage? What would actually solve that disadvantage? Is the thing they're suggesting or that anyone is suggesting actually going to solve that disadvantage? And is it reasonable? And in terms of the assessment of reasonableness, the slide has put down 1, 2, 3, 4 factors: cost, disruption, and the resources to do it. Is financial assistance available? That's not all of the factors, but it's some quite common ones. As I said, one of my personal favorites is this: to the extent that it'll work. I mean, if it's going to cost £500,000 and it probably only has a 20% chance of working, it's a lot less likely to be reasonable than if it is expensive but it's guaranteed to work. Then that's a relevant factor to consider. And then only a job-related adjustment, you don't have to pay for things that don't impact on the workplace. But if you've worked through the steps, you shouldn't be falling into a trap of providing adjustments that don't relate to the workplace. And then finally, a very important point: actual or assumed knowledge of disability. One of the most common traps employers can fall into is where they fail to make reasonable adjustments because they didn't know the person was disabled, but later down the line an employment tribunal holds that they ought reasonably to have known. And it's worth remembering the concept of assumed knowledge, or sometimes called constructive knowledge or imputed knowledge. I like to describe that as just making sure you're not closing your eyes to the obvious. If an employee at work is behaving differently or in a way that is concerning or unusual, then you can't just ignore that, or you could, but you might get into a tangle and get in a situation where you're held to have had assumed knowledge of disability. What you're required to do is take reasonable steps to find out. And that might just start with the really basic: having a word with the employee. Is everything okay? I've noticed this, or somebody has said that. Just checking that there's nothing to be worried about. Or it could involve going a bit further and saying, well, okay, but I think we need to get some input from occupational health or another expert. Because it's certainly not that unusual for employers to say, sorry, not employers, an employment tribunal would say that the employer should have taken steps, including getting occupational health advice. And if they had done so, what they would have found out is that the person did have a disability. And they can make that finding because usually by the time you've got to tribunal, that expert evidence does exist and it does say that they would have had a disability. And it's not such a leap to suggest that had you done that at the time, you would have found that out. Another thing I wanted to flag about actual or assumed knowledge of disability, which I flagged from experience of cases in the past, is where certain people at the employer know that the person suffers from a disability and others don't, and the others do things that are potentially acts of discrimination in that they don't make adjustments, or they do things that could constitute unfavorable treatment. And so it's important to have a mechanism of finding out. A piece of resource that if you haven't all looked at it at one time or another, I recommend is the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Statutory Code of Practice, which sets out guidance on how you would ensure information about disability is shared. And I'll quote from it because it's quite a good little piece. It says, employers need to ensure that where information about disabled people may come through different channels, there is a means suitably confidential and subject to the disabled person's consent, for bringing that information together to make it easier for the employer to fulfill their duties under the Act. And that can be a tricky one, where certain employees are concerned about other people knowing, but the risk in there's risk both ways there in terms of if you maintain confidentiality too well, then you can potentially fall into the trap of committing acts of discrimination unknowingly because people just simply weren't aware. So it can be a tricky area, but one to be aware of. So this slide summarizes a few steps to take that I've alluded to already. Talk to employee about their ideas for potential adjustments. It should be a two-way conversation. As I said, try and focus on the practical. How would it help? And try not to be fixated on any particular idea, or if an employee is fixated on a particular idea, by all means listen to their idea, but look at other options. There's usually more than one way to do things. And the assessment of reasonable will look at various options for adjustments, which are the most appropriate, which are the most reasonable, considering all the factors we looked at in the previous slide, and other factors, and the guidance I just pointed to has a good analysis of reasonable adjustments in that context. Seek medical advice about the potential adjustments. Yes, don't just rely on what you think and what the employee thinks. Ask the experts. Nick's going to come on to medical advice in a bit, so I won't steal his thunder too much on that. The next point, taking it back to the theme of this seminar, the mental health side. Are we doing our health and safety executive stress risk assessment? I've noticed it's becoming more and more common for occupational health advisors to recommend that employers do this, and positively it's becoming more and more common that employers are already doing this before being prompted, which can only be a good thing in identifying issues and addressing things. And as Nick said earlier, nipping things in the bud, even if that's not as dramatic as avoiding claims, it's just avoiding sickness absence, avoiding underperformance just by taking proactive steps. And then finally, with all adjustments, they should be kept under review. Is it still working? Is it not? Could be doing something differently. And that's the same also with risk assessments. They should be kept under review. And I'm going to go through on the next few slides, after the next one, some factors to take into account when doing a risk assessment in the mental health context. But a quick summary on reasonable adjustments. Consult with employees about the adjustments and keep them under review, both from their practicability and their viability. Keep a record of things. It wouldn't be one of our seminars if we didn't mention somewhere about keeping a paper trail just in case you end up in tribunal. And especially the point about the reasoning. Often, if you're a witness in a tribunal, the thing that the tribunal is interested in is the why, the mental state. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why did you not do this? And if you've kept a record, that will really help both you just simply to remember and to convince the tribunal that genuinely was the reason. So do keep good records of why decisions are made and why things were and weren't done. So as I trailed a couple of slides ago, the stress risk assessment is a thing that's becoming more and more common. Just taking it a step back, as you probably know, employers are under a legal duty to protect workers from stress at work by doing a risk assessment, and that the duty to protect workers is a general one, and stress is just one subset of the risk. I'm not going to talk about the usual, what you might sort of historically think of the risk assessment, the sort of slips and trips. We're going to ignore all that for this morning and then just look at the mental health aspect. And the stress risk assessment is looking to assess the risk of stress and its impact, but in the same way as you might assess other risks. Now, if you need a sort of starting point, some of you probably already got your own, but if you haven't, there's a good template risk assessment on the Health and Safety Executive website. It's quite generic, but it would allow you to grow or use as a starting point. And it links into what they call their management standards, which are for different things, that we're going to look at all 6 of their management standards in turn, and all become clear what I mean by that when we go through them. And these standards link to issues of mental health and stress at work. The first is demands. So that's the demand of the job, workload, work patterns, the work environment. And what HSE is saying is you should be looking at whether your employee can cope. And if they can't, or in case they can't, are there safety nets, structures in place to assist them? Can they speak to their manager? Is there suitable support there if it's needed? And it's just ensuring that it's documented that you've thought about that, and that's all in place if it's needed. The second one I thought was an interesting one: control. How much say the person has in the way that they work. Ideally, and from a stress risk perspective, the more say, the better. I think that's going to be very much job specific, because in certain roles there's going to be more scope for that than others. But I guess that's part of the risk assessment, assessing what risk there is of in a scenario where there is limited control, because it's very process driven. That might be a risk factor that you need to note and work out ways of trying to mitigate that if you think it's a concern. Support, very sensible one in this context. The encouragement, sponsorship and resources provided by the organisation, line management and colleagues. And from an employment laws perspective, you're looking at the support systems. Is there the method of managing performance? Is there the method of coaching and things like buddy systems, mentoring? Are we looking at ways to support people where they might be struggling? And that might be less formal than the traditional capability procedure, performance improvement plans, and things that are there under the surface that can kick in before anything more formal is ever needed. Relationships, probably one of the more obvious ones that would spring to mind: promoting positive working to avoid conflict. And again, from the employment side, you're going to be wanting to have the policies that probably a lot of you have: anti-bullying and harassment, grievance, disciplinary, so that people know that if that positive workplace falls down, there is the safety net. But also from the more positive side, are you doing things that are more proactive from a positive angle, team building and that kind of thing, to ensure that relationships are positively developed, as well as having that safety net for where they might decline or diminish, or there might be certain conflicts that arise. And the last two, I think, are quite important ones, because they're always going to be affecting workplaces. The fifth one, role, making sure people understand their role and that employees don't have conflicting roles. Often one of the biggest issues you see is where an employee doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing, or is doing the wrong thing and frustration abounds, or where more than one person thinks they should be doing something and there's conflict between the two of them because they consider that to be their job rather than other person's. So just having clear delineation of who should be doing what and clear management lines and job descriptions will hopefully avoid unnecessary stress over roles and conflicts of role. And the last one, change, always a tricky area, how organizational change is managed and communicated. Many people really struggle with change. So if you are introducing change, whilst it's easy to say there needs to be good consultation, I was thinking about what does that mean. Well, I think it needs to be meaningful and two-way, so that there's a genuine attempt to listen and react, and it's not just a sort of lip service or box ticking exercise where we work through meetings to get to the desired outcome. There's actually a two-way process whereby things can change. I think it's very important that any consultation about change is timely, and by that I mean it happens early enough so that it's not too late to have any impact. If it's we're doing X, Y, and Z in a week's time, let's consult about it now, there's very little chance that any of that consultation is going to make much of a difference, because it's just simply too late. And clearly within those first two, the other third most important thing is if it's genuine. It wouldn't be meaningful if it wasn't genuine, but employees want to see that if they're raising points, that those they're being consulted with are genuinely listening, with the prospect of things actually changing. I always think it's a positive on consultation if an employer goes in with, we're going to do this, that and the other, and the employees say, well, why don't we do that, and you change it. Sometimes employers are reluctant to change because they think it shows that there was holes in their original plan, but in many ways I think it's often a more positive step to say, well, actually no, we aren't always right, we actually think the ideas that have been presented are better, we will do those instead, and it can show strength rather than weakness. And finally, just pulling the two together really in terms of once you've done your stress risk assessments and we've looked at the risk of reasonable adjustments, what are some examples? And by all means, add in the chat, because reasonable adjustments are very specific to individual people and how any particular condition affects them. Be interested to know if anybody's had any specific things that are perhaps unusual that have really worked. We've put some examples on this slide, allowing someone with social anxiety disorder to have their own desk instead of hot desking. A lot of people really don't like hot desking, but that might be the only option for employers where the numbers outweigh the number of desks. But that doesn't mean there can't be exceptions. The Equality Act and the whole concept of reasonable adjustments is in essence about making exceptions for people who have disabilities. Providing quiet working areas in the office is another common one. And linking on to what Nick was saying, post the pandemic, I think people have got used to different working environments. Perhaps before, when everyone was more commonly in an office environment, people more used to it. Now it's more of an adjustment when people are flicking between the two. The third, increased levels of home working. Home working can be a bit of a bone of contention these days. There's a lot of employers, you've probably read in the news, there's some quite big ones, really driving people back to the office now, a few years post-pandemic. And I think sometimes the home working reasonable adjustment is a difficult one. So some employers are saying, I want to work from home all the time. Occupational health might say they benefit from home working, but occasionally it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If the person's at home all the time, they might become distant, perhaps lonely, their performance might suffer. So whilst for some people that might be a brilliant adjustment and really work to solve the issue and get a high level of performance, for others it might not, and it's something that might need to be kept under review. It'd be interesting if anyone's got any specific experience to understand. And then finally, phased returns to work, altering working hours. Again, a common one. Phased returns, you're probably all very familiar with. Similarly, altering working hours, and that can be for things as simple as avoiding the stress of a commute, coming in slightly later or earlier, working a different lunch hour. These adjustments don't need to be too groundbreaking. If they work, then great. And that's the end of my session. Go hand over to Nick now for medical advice.
Thanks, James. That's great. And thanks everyone who's contributed in the chat. There's lots of good recommendations for various organisations that have helped support in this area. So do take a look there because I think that would be really valuable. Yeah, we would also be interested in any strange reasonable adjustments that have been suggested as well. That's always interesting to hear about. The other one, I was chatting with an HR director not long ago, and she was highlighting the irony of the reasonable adjustment that seems to be more common of being encouraged to work from home. Because it will remove stress and anxiety and that kind of thing. And I think that might well be the case. I think she was flagging the irony of an occupational health practitioner who was fully remote, working at home, doing an assessment online, then suggesting that the person should spend more time at home. So I think, yeah, it's a tricky one when it comes to that, because clearly avoiding the office altogether, if that's the source of stress, rather than addressing that, won't necessarily be the best option. But yeah, we'll see. So medical advice, clearly a really important part of managing a mental health issue with an employee, and if we're honest, one that very often comes across our desk, where employers are frustrated by the fact that actually the medical advice that they've got isn't really that helpful. So sometimes we'll have there'll be the reports will have been sent through and they'll be described as woolly, or not really giving any certainty as to how best to support the employee. So again, if that's not the case and you have come across a really good occupational health provider, do share the details. That would be great, and I suspect they'll be busy. But I think the other thing to flag is that the occupational health isn't necessarily the only option. It can be the case that we might contact the individual's GP to get a view from them. And I think Sometimes that might be helpful, but again, I think it's often difficult there because the GP doesn't have that specific training around the workplace, which is what occupational health bring as well, which I think is generally very helpful. It might be that you have a particularly complex mental health issue that might even require a specialist independent medical expert. But again, that's rare. I think occupational health tends to be the go-to. In terms of managing that process, clearly employee consent is important. So again, ensuring that you've got consent for that person to attend the medical appointment. If there's release of medical records, consent from that perspective, and that covers both the medical side, but also data protection, as we've flagged there. I think the other issue that we sometimes have is that employees refuse to consent to that. And again, that sometimes is a sticking point for employers. Usually what we will do is try a number of times to ask and explain why it's helpful for us to have medical advice to support us supporting them with their mental health issue. And if they continue to refuse, then usually what we're saying is, well, we'll have to take decisions with regards to your employment and how we best support you. In the absence of that, we prefer not to, but we clearly need to deal with this. So there are ways around that. Clearly, it's not quite as helpful without medical advice. Hence, the focus on that. The other thing that is important when it comes to this side of things is setting the scene, as we've described it, and using the referral. So it might be through a portal or a letter, or however your occupational health provider allows for that, and setting the scene so that there's a balanced sort of view. Obviously, the employee will go and explain from their perspective what the situation is, and that's really helpful for that medical person. But actually, the employer doing the same and setting out enough background as to what the person does. So maybe including their job description, emphasising that we understand our duty of care to the individual, and we're really keen to support them back to work if we can. The history of absence, the adjustments that we might have already considered that may or may not be helping, emphasizing the impact on performance. So again, I talked at the beginning about the fact that often these issues are someone that's underperforming, not necessarily absent, but underperforming and needs support in getting to the required level of performance, but their actual mental health condition is impacting on that. And just explaining that in enough detail so that the occupational health provider understands the impact that this is having from our perspective as we perceive it is really important, and often missed. But sometimes I think because employers are cautious about emphasizing that and are very focused on helping the employee, which I think is really important. But actually, it's vital that the medical person, be it the GP or occupational health, have the full picture as to what's going on. And that even includes the impact on the business. So it's costing us more because this person is absent, or the team is not as productive because this person isn't performing well. And weaving in that side of things is really important when it comes to this as well. Giving enough information is pretty much what I've covered there. But the other thing that is often tricky is whether the occupational health provider can give a proper view without the full medical history. And it used to be the case that we would nearly always recommend that that clients requested medical records from GP so that they could send them on to the occupational health provider so they had the full picture. GPs are so stretched, and it was taking so long for that, just to get a printed copy or a photocopy of medical records, that delayed the process significantly. And our general approach now is to ensure that as part of the referral, we're pushing responsibility for whether the occupational health practitioner has enough information onto them. So we'll often say in the referral, please confirm if you need any further information that you've got everything you need, including whether medical records would be helpful. Our experience is that very few are requiring those, are requesting those, and it's more the case that they're going on the basis of their assessment of the person which obviously is their professional decision, but it does impact I think the reliability of their assessment often. Then again, a lot of the work that we would do in this area is helping clients ask the right questions of the occupational health provider. So again, lots of these issues can be very complicated, but actually the way that we improve the quality of the report we get back is by asking questions in the right way. And I think often, again, employers are reluctant to be direct in terms of the questions they're asking, or even following up on a report that we've already had to say, actually, this doesn't help us. Please, can you have another go? You know, and I think that's absolutely fine. Just because we've received the report doesn't mean that we can't go back and ask for clarification, or ask them to actually answer questions if they haven't been answered. So again, we have a sort of methodology that we often, share with clients when we're working through these in terms of increasing the chances that we get helpful answers. The other thing is asking the right questions is important, but not asking the wrong questions might seem a bit of a strange way of looking at it. But I think keeping focus, for example, not asking too many questions where it all then ends up in a kind of a blur as a result of the amount of information that we've got back, but honing in on the key issues that we need to know about in order to support this person, in order to understand the condition, in order to understand what adjustments in particular might be helpful to, as James was talking about, alleviate that disadvantage that they are experiencing is really, really important. The other side of it is James quite rightly, I think, said, let's not get too hung up over whether the person meets the definition of disabled in the Equality Act. And we again talk quite a bit about that, because in reality, it doesn't matter too much when you're managing these issues. In reality, is it possible? Is it possible just to wait until the end? We'll have a section for questions towards the end, if that's okay, or pop it in the chat if that's easier. Thank you. So not necessarily even asking whether the person is disabled sometimes is a bit controversial, but in reality, our view is that it doesn't really make too much of a difference, because you still have an employee who has a medical condition that needs managing. You're still going to need to support them. You still need to engage with them. And actually, sometimes there are disadvantages of asking that question of the occupational health provider, because we then have a record that confirms, in their view, that they meet the Equality Act definition. And sometimes that puts us on the back foot in terms of things further down the line, like defending discrimination claims or that kind of thing. I think it can be a bit controversial, but we would sometimes even suggest taking that question off the medical referral, because in the end, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. We still will need to manage the situation well. Once the report's back, as I said, it's about getting into the detail of that, analysing it, ensuring that it actually is helpful. And if it's not, going back for clarification. I think then sometimes missed is the fact that we should then talk to the employee about the report. And that might be as simple as opening with, we've had the medical advice, what do you think about it? And starting that conversation, engaging with them on that, particularly if we're looking at adjustments that we might put in place with regards to mental health issues. I think having that dialogue and engaging with the employer about, okay, well, this is what the report suggests would be helpful to you. We're going to try that, or actually we've reviewed it and we were not able to try that one for these reasons, and we wanted to talk to you about that and why that is a really vital point, part of that. But considering those adjustments and potentially even adjustments that might involve fairly significant changes to the person's role, or even redeployment into another role. There's been a number of tribunal cases recently where issues like this have come about, and the tribunals seemed very keen that employers at the very least give other roles a try that might have helped alleviate some of the issues that the person was experiencing from a mental health perspective. And that on occasion were even roles that the person wasn't necessarily even qualified to do, which in some ways is quite surprising, but they were effectively suggesting that there should be some sort of trial period that the person's allowed in order to give it a go and see whether actually the person could do those jobs. So again, it feels a bit like, you know, that there's a fairly high expectation that people consider, you know, these adjustments well, and that, as I say, it might even be the case that, you know, you have to give things a go that you think, well, that's probably not going to work. Well, actually, it might, and therefore a tribunal might expect you to, particularly when it comes to that kind of other role and redeployment. We're then, when we've got that report, looking hopefully for clear answers as to whether an improvement in that person's health, in their mental health, is likely. And it might well be that actually we're looking at adjustments. We've got some that have come out as part of the report. We're going to give those a try. We're going to hope that that improves attendance and that improves performance. And that will then just need a period of time to allow that to work, hopefully, and to assess whether that's working. And then I think it would be a further review, maybe even further medical advice. I think if we're towards the latter stages of that process, and we're getting a medical view which suggests that actually, despite the adjustments being made, improvement isn't likely. Either the person isn't going to be able to perform at the required level, or isn't going to be able to attend work. Then we're looking at things like, okay, well, where have we got to with a more normal performance management process, or actually, if it's, you know, absence related, is it at a level that would allow us to consider warnings or dismissal or that kind of thing. And again, matching that against the business need, where we have a business case for requiring people performing in their roles or attending work, you know, to the required level, is really important to match those up against each other as well. So sort of in summary, when it comes to the medical advice side, where we're obviously seeking that, and I think that I guess that may be an obvious point, but sometimes that's missed. You know, neither employees or employers are actually medical experts. So when it comes to some of these, particularly mental health issues, can be very complex and have a number of facets. You know, actually getting some medical advice in the first place is really, really important, so that we're properly informed, particularly as an employer, as to you know, what is necessary. Consulting with the employee, so again, engaging with them, talking about them. We all know that there's, you know, particularly with managers, sometimes there's a reluctance to talk directly with employees about their mental health issues often. But I think breaking down that stigma and talking to them about the situation and understanding where they're at and what medical advice we have and where we are in the process and all that kind of thing is really important. Weaving in that business need side, you know, what impact is this having on the business as well as on the employee? As James talked about, keeping a good audit trail, you know, is always really, really important in these cases, to show what we've considered, what medical advice do we have, what reasonable adjustments have we looked at, and that will contribute to it being a fair procedure. And then being clear that we've actually looked at other options, both adjustments, redeployment, that kind of thing, in terms of, you know, managing that situation is super important. So Laura's going to pick up from this point and take us through a few employment tribunal claims that are in this area where, surprise, surprise, employers have got this spectacularly wrong. So these are not great examples. We're now jumping from here's how you do it well to this is how you shouldn't do it, I guess. So I'll hand over to Laura. There'll be links to the judgments on these cases if you want more of a read and more detail appearing in the chat as well.
Thanks, Nick. Morning, everyone. So as Nick was saying, there's a few cases here where people really have got it wrong. And there's going to be a few times where you probably think they said what or they did what. And I'm just going to talk you through what happened. The other thing that I will flag right at the very start is that in context of talking through these ones, we do talk about specific mental health conditions and the impact that that had on the individual. So just a bit of a warning that I may be mentioning suicidal thoughts, eating disorders and things like that as we go through. So the very first case that I'm going to take you through should be on the slide in front of you now. So Ms. Zaleska versus Cameo Consultancy Recruitment. So she was an agency worker, obviously with the recruitment agency that's on the screen. He was placed on a 12-week assignment with Principal Medical Limited at a specific medical centre. She was temporary administrator with them, and then her role was essentially to do the admin of the general practitioners. On her third day, she was taking payment details over the phone from a client, or a patient, sorry. Struggled to take it because perhaps the phone line wasn't very good, but either way, she was struggling to do it, and the phone was grabbed off her by another member of staff, incidentally the person who was training her. He took over the call and made comments saying that the claimant was overstressed and panicking to the patient on the other end of the line. Understandably, she felt that this wasn't very professional and went to speak to a manager at the medical centre about the incident, and in that conversation said to them that she'd had previous issues in workplaces and that she suffered with her mental health, including anxiety and depression, and took antidepressants. While she was talking about her mental health conditions, she got quite upset because it was a very emotive topic to be talking about. And it was decided that she should take the rest of the day off, go home and phone her GP, which again, ironically, was the place that she was actually working in. So she left the building, went to go home after this conversation, and the employment tribunal heard evidence that immediately after she left, the manager at the medical centre phoned the recruitment agent and essentially made comments saying that there was a sorry state of affairs this morning, that she'd become hysterical and crying and couldn't cope with the workload. There was then a discussion between the manager at the medical centre and the recruitment agent, where they both decided between them to end her assignment there. So this essentially discussion, they were talking about what had happened that morning, that she'd become so terribly upset. And then between them were making comments that perhaps she wasn't the right fit for the role, she didn't have the mental resilience for the role, that she would be potentially talking to patients who were also unwell. So the tribunal quite heavily criticised that there was an element of people putting into her mouth things that she may or may not be able to do and things that she may or may not be able to deal with. So after she got home that day, the recruitment agent phoned her and essentially just said, your assignment there is finished, we'll try and find you something else. There was no welfare check on her, there was no sorry to hear what happened this morning, no discussion about it. There was absolutely no discussion about perhaps, well, maybe you could go back but do this type of work, or maybe we could have a little chat with the person that made these comments on the phone. So the tribunal, like I say, heard some evidence from the individuals that made the decision, so the manager and the recruitment agent, and essentially slated them for putting those words into the mouth and deciding on her behalf that she wouldn't be able to perform the role without speaking to her at all, or really considering what may be appropriate to do that. They also found that her dismissal was essentially all because she disclosed her mental health issue. So they made comments saying that anyone else that hadn't done that and had become upset at work on that morning wouldn't have been dismissed, and that they found that it was because she'd said that she suffered from anxiety and depression that they jumped to this, well, she can't do the job, she doesn't have the mental resilience for this, and that somebody that wasn't disabled and hadn't disclosed that would not have been treated in the same way. So you'll see that they were ordered to pay £18,703.79, and of that, £14,000 was for injury to feelings. So we're already starting with a fairly high injury to feelings award on this one. So the learning points in terms of what this case taught us was the impact of really considering speaking to the individual about any health concerns they've raised, and as James was saying, anything that you might have knowledge of. And talking with them, and as Nick was saying about the reasonable adjustments, is there anything that could have been done? And not jumping immediately to, well, maybe they can't do this job, so we need to do something different. Or in worst case scenario, as here, simply removing them from work. So the next case that we're going to look at, Miss Thomas versus TNR Direct Insurance. So this was a family-run business. She worked for them from March 2020. As you can see, in April 2022, she ended up being signed off for 4 weeks due to her mental health, and the fit note said anxiety and depression and stress at work. So working backwards, what had happened immediately before that, there had been 4 people left the business and she was taking on all of their work. So whilst there may not have been an absolute, it was because she took on the extra work that she ended up being signed off. There is an absolute causal link to her mental health deteriorating and it exasperating her existing mental health conditions. You'll see on the slide there that there was derogatory comments made, including, "I'm surprised you aren't the size of a house, the amount you eat," to her. She had previously disclosed that she had a history of eating disorders. So obviously not an appropriate thing to say at any time, but particularly when somebody has actively said, "I struggle with this." So she returned to work for her period of being off with stress and anxiety, etc. And essentially it just got worse for her. So the comments about her eating continued. Any ideas or suggestions she made were rebutted, including having her laptop and keys removed to the office. There was a junior role that was advertised at a level that was much lower than hers, but a salary that was higher. She was told that she was now a less reliable member of staff because she'd taken time off. And essentially they were trying to pass on some blame to her that other people had had to absorb some of her workload while she was away. She was also accused of faking her conditions. So there was a lot of things that were said to her that were quite obviously inappropriate and contributed to her mental health. This resulted in her resigning and successfully claiming constructive dismissal, discrimination arising from disability and harassment. An interesting one here was the respondent tried to argue that they had no knowledge of her mental health. What actually then happened during disclosure, for anyone that's been through the tribunal system, you're ordered to disclose any documents that are relevant to proceedings, so that can be emails, Teams chats, WhatsApps, etc. Was that Miss Thomas actually produced a whole load of WhatsApps where she'd told her manager or somebody else in the business that she couldn't come into work today because she'd had an anxiety attack. She couldn't come into work today because she'd self-harmed and needed to take some time to recover and go and seek help. And various of the things where she'd mentioned very explicitly and very openly the impact of her mental health on her work. And yet the respondent still sought to say that they didn't know about it. And that obviously crumbled in the tribunal when she then produced multiple documents showing that they did. So they were ordered to pay £56,542.06, and now a slightly bigger injury to feelings award. So 24,000 of that was the injury to feelings for the discrimination claim. And again, the learning points on that, as James was saying, being mindful of actual or potential knowledge of disability and keeping that in mind. And perhaps a training point here that the managers essentially said, "We didn't know we couldn't make those jokes. We thought it was banter. We thought it was okay." Clearly, making comments like that is not okay. But perhaps a reminder on, particularly when somebody has come and said, "I'm struggling with this and this is what I need," making sure that they actually action it, making sure that they take that away and think, okay, what do we need to do here? Do they need to have a phased return to work? Do they need to have a reduced workload? Do they need something else to enable them to return from work, return from their period of sickness absence, and just help them and support them through that process? So the final case I'm going to take you through, and you'll see that the parties' names are anonymised here, and you'll see that that was predominantly because it was a person who was working as an assistant for a barrister. She worked for the barrister directly. She wasn't employed by the chambers or the legal organisation. And prior to starting work there, she had been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, post-traumatic stress disorder, which was ongoing, depression and anxiety, all of which she spoke about at her interview, and at the start of her time there was very, again, open and said, "This is what I suffer with, this is the impact it might have on my work." So the claimant here asked for 2 days off at the weekend and explained that because of her fibromyalgia, she needed to have time to rest and recover and essentially get some time back to help her body. She then went further and said that actually the anxiousness and the amount of work that she was being put through, she needed some time again to mentally reset and just take time away from screens or phones, etc. The respondent told her that she wasn't allowed to take any days off, and if she was unable to do her job for 7 days a week, her job would be given to somebody else. And essentially pushed back on every single front that she tried to say, "No, I need to have a few minutes, I need to do this." The tribunal heard evidence that essentially the way that the work was given out there, and the expectations were that if she was emailed, even if it was 9 o'clock on a Saturday, it was done. It was picked up, it was responded to. She consistently raised complaints about this and said, I can't cope with this, it is too much for me, I'm getting no family life, I'm getting no private life. I'm not able to physically sit on a phone 24 hours a day. I can't do that. It's affecting my mental health. It's making my existing conditions worse. It got to the point that C then just said, I can't do this anymore, resigned and walked away. The day after that, the defendant, the respondent barrister, wrote on a group WhatsApp chat that the claimant was no longer part of. The best place for her is a mental asylum with no access to internet or Wi-Fi and restraint. Lol. Again, not an appropriate thing to be writing at all. But the point of including that is that when I come on to remedy, you'll see that the remedy actually increased because of the fact that the harassment and discrimination was ongoing all the way through her employment and then immediately afterwards. And in fact, throughout the conduct of proceedings, that the respondent barrister was not complying with the orders or talking to the tribunal, or in some places not putting in a response or not turning up. So you'll see that C was successful in their claim to make a failure to make reasonable adjustments, and that was all to do with the asking for time off or time to be away from screens, etc. Unfavourable treatment as a consequence of something arising from her disability and harassment. This is a rather large sum, as you'll have seen. So she's ordered to pay 155,413.61 to the individual, and of that, 90,000 of that was for injury to feelings. So one of the largest type of injury to feelings award you can get, as Nick was saying, the Vento bans. To get into that ban, there needs to be a really serious and sustained impact and effect on the individual. The reason that it was so high here, as I mentioned in passing, was the fact that it had been ongoing all the way through employment and afterwards. But also it got to a point that actually C had a really, really serious psychological collapse, was how it was described by her consultant, ended up in A&E, and ended up being able to essentially not walk unaided, daily seizures, speech difficulties, and had such an impact on her that she may not be able to work potentially again, or if for now, in the very near future. So there was a very serious impact on her ability moving forward. So sources of support. Where can you signpost your employees? So obviously we're hoping that you don't end up in a situation of the people we've just been talking about, that you're right at the end of that and something's gone catastrophically wrong. The employee assistance program. So employee assistance programs are benefits programs or anything that provides stuff to your employees that they can take from. There's never a right time to remind people of that, but actually we've just had Mental Health Awareness Week. It may be as good a time as any to put a note on notice boards or on your intranet, wherever you have it, reminding people of any benefits or assistance programs you have, how to access it and what it offers. So I think there's sometimes a danger that people think, well, it's just for people that want counselling. It's not always that. Employee assistance programs offer a whole range of things, and it's worth, maybe if you're the person that looks after it and you're the person talking to employees, digging out what yours does and flagging that to employees. It might be that it offers them discounted gym memberships. You'll probably all have heard last week and been reminded that exercise is good for mental health. So that might be one thing to signpost people to. It might offer reductions on food shopping. Cost of living at the moment is a cause of stress for many, many people. So pointing them in the direction that actually you have this scheme that could help them in various ways. And obviously, if they want to take advantage of counselling or talking therapies that are sometimes on these, then absolutely that is there too. There are various charities and organisations that you might wish to signpost people to. And this will really depend on the individual and what they're coming to you with. So we've popped a few on there. So Campaign Against Living Miserably, who is one of our wonderful clients who we enjoy working with. So they obviously will have a helpline, a web chat, etc. that people can call. Samaritans, again, I'm sure you're all familiar with, same sort of premise, that they have a helpline, they have a web chat, and I think they're opening a text service as well, that it might be appropriate for you to tell people to give them a call or whatever needs to be done. There's Shout, which is a text messaging service. So if some people feel that they're not actually in a position that they can talk, there is that option of a text message that they can go and fire a text up and say, I'm not feeling that great, I need to have a chat. And then there's Papyrus, which is prevention of young suicide. Suicide is one of the biggest killers, in fact, is the biggest killer of people under 35 in the UK. They offer this service up to people 35, and they also offer it to parents of children, etc. So pointing people in that direction. The other thing, again, as we're saying, perhaps not always jumping to it needs to be an organisation like this. People may be concerned about debt. It could be appropriate to point them to Debtline or Money Advice. It could be appropriate in their circumstances to point them to Refuge or Women's Aid, or an alcohol or drug charity. There's a million resources out there that, if you have a look, will help you have a thought about who they should go to. And certainly, if you've got your mental health first aiders, as Nick was saying earlier, Nick and I have done that training, they will probably have a list somewhere that they can dig out to help you with in terms of that. So the bottom one, NHS mental health services. If you are in a position that you've got an employee in front of you that you think actually they really, really are quite seriously ill, as Nick was saying, get them to talk to their GP in first instance, or potentially occupational health. But if that is escalated and you've got a serious situation on your hands, assessing that risk, it could be 111, it could be asking them to refer to the crisis team, and that would be via their GP. Or essentially, if there's an emergency, obviously phoning 999. So protecting your organisation, and this is a bit of a recap on what the guys were saying earlier. So as James mentioned, there's stress risk assessments that can be done. And yeah, treating those in the same way as you would any other risk assessment, looking at what could help your employees, what might be something that is a good idea. And as always, not just having it there as a bit of paper to go, well, we've got it. Actually actioning it and doing the stuff that you said you're going to do. The same thing as, again, having good policies, as Nick mentioned, capability, absence, mental health policies, having a look through, checking whether they need updating. Are they up to date in terms of mental health? Is there anything else that you could think about? Whether that be changes to triggers, changes to anything else that needs to happen. And obviously, we're more than happy to chat through that with you. And the same point again, it's all well and good having policy, remembering to follow.
It is, yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask whoever that is to mute or if you find it?
Yes, that's right.
So the other problem that you might find, as I was saying there on good procedures, is training your management on them. So if they're the people that are actually doing the procedures and putting people through the processes, making sure that management know what to do and what to look out for. Again, Nick's already touched on these as well. So employment contracts, having that clause in that talks about referring to medical advice, making sure that your sick pay clause is clear and does what you need it to do for certain situations. Training, as we've said during the cases that I was just talking you through, training is one of the best ways of trying to improve your organisation in terms of how people deal with mental health situations if they're brought to them, how they deal with them if they're asked to run a process or something with somebody that has disclosed or potentially has a mental health issue. Training mental health first aiders, first responders, mental health champions, whatever you call them in your business, and making sure that people know who they are, how they can be contacted, and making space and time for that to happen. And then having good conversations. A lot of the cases that I just took you through and a lot of the things that we've been considering as we've been going through are actually just sitting down with an individual and having a chat and talking, okay, so what are you worried about? What can we do to help you? And running through your processes in that way can only ever be a good thing. That it provides the audit trail that we've all been banging on about for many of these webinars now, that it shows that actually you did investigate and you did look at perhaps reasonable adjustments or other options, but also just supporting and caring for your employees in terms of having those conversations as and when needed. I think I'm going to pass over to Nick now. So any questions, etc.
Thanks, Laura. So we've reached the end. We do have a little bit of time for some questions. If you have any, either pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up there, or it may be that you can unmute and fire a question at us that way. It's always nice to hear from people. So we'll give a couple of minutes for people to type anything in that they would like to. While you're doing that, for those that were a bit later joining, we're just flagging a couple of things just to finish. We're We have a menopause event coming up with Boots at Boots HQ, working with Hempicked. The details are there, and again, the sign up link for that should be in the chat. It might appear again to save you scrolling back through that. Thanks to everybody who's been sharing OH recommendations and EAP recommendations. Hopefully, if you're either not happy with your current provider or you don't have one and you're considering it, there's some good options there. So that's really helpful. But that's the Boots menopause event. Thank you, Matt, for the link. We also mentioned the HRD Talks podcast. Latest episode was released this month with Dawn at Fuller's. So hopefully that's a useful resource to listen to as well. And we also will be running our next webinar next month, and we're going to be crystal ball gazing a little, so looking at what might be changing in the world of employment law and HR should we have a change of government, and should we have a Labour government specifically, and looking at some of the sort of election promises that they've made in terms of what they might be changing. So yeah, that is to come. Keep an eye out on LinkedIn and also in your email inbox for further details of that. I'm not sure if we've had any questions pop through. If anybody's got anything, your time's running out. Feel free, be brave. But if not, then that's no problem too. Hopefully that's been helpful for everybody. It's great to see you all. Thanks for joining us. Do access the chat to get those recommendations. The case judgments are there in case you wanted a bit more detail on those as well. The cases that Laura was talking about. We've put the links to the health and safety executive toolkits in there as well. So as we've said, there's a whole wealth of resources when it comes to this area, in some ways slightly overwhelming in terms of the amount that there is to consider, but certainly, you know, there's plenty of assistance should you need it, and hopefully we're avoiding issues getting out of hand, and yeah, keeping people happy and in work and doing well. Okay, we've had a couple of thank yous, no questions, so we've got off lightly this time around. As I say, great to see everybody, and yeah, we'll catch you next time for the employment law update. Thanks everyone.